Okay, well, welcome to Plymouth Methodist Central Hall's Bible Study. If you're here in the room or whether you're watching us online, you're really welcome. As Gareth introduced last week, we're beginning a series looking at a particular portion of Matthew's Gospel. We're in Matthew chapter 8 today, so if you're using the Bibles that are in this room, you'll find our reading on page 973. And we're just going to read 5 verses today. So I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 8, and I'm going to read verses 18 to 22. So that's Matthew 8, 18 to 22. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Well, the context of this reading is on the shoreline of Capernaum. I can picture the scene vividly. Jesus, at this point in his ministry, has made Capernaum his base. It was where Peter lived. Not far, to give you an idea, Jesus grew up, his hometown was Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. Capernaum, if you went there now, and I did this journey just a few weeks ago, if you go from Nazareth to Capernaum, it's about a 45-minute drive on a coach. And the scene that we're kind of dipping into Matthew's Gospel here is of Jesus on the shoreline at Capernaum. And if any of you have been to Capernaum, I know at least 4 of you have, because I took you there. If you've been to Capernaum, you'll realise that the ruins of the city or the town of Capernaum are quite well maintained, and you can easily picture where certain things would have been. You can go to a church, it's a beautiful church, which sounds a little bit odd, but it's got a glass bottom to it. So you can be in the church, and underneath you, so you can see through the floor, and what you're looking at, the church is like in the shape almost like a UFO. And it's got a glass bottom to it, and underneath is Simon Peter's home. The church is built there intentionally on top of what was Simon Peter's home. If you leave that church now, and you just go out of it, down some steps, turn left, within about a minute, you're on the shoreline of Capernaum. So from Simon Peter's home, you would have been able to hear if it's a stormy day, the waves kind of on the shoreline. Very close to where you kind of left off your teaching last week that Gareth would have led you on. It was in Peter's home that his mother-in-law was healed. You read it last week. I'll just remind you of these verses. When Jesus came to Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. And we're now at the shoreline. Jesus is most likely looking for some space. If you You can imagine in Capernaum, what you read last week, you read of a man with leprosy healed. You read of the faith of the centurion who came and said, my servant lies at home, and Jesus says, go, and he'll be healed. Jesus then, we read about, heals many. Peter's mother-in-law is just one that is mentioned specifically. I'm sure there would have been people clamoring for his attention as news of this miracle worker is going around the region. So Jesus, as we pick up the reading in verse 18 today, it says he saw the crowd around him and he gave orders to them to cross to the other side of the lake. The lake isn't that big if you've been there. If you're in a boat in the middle of the lake, you can see the shore on every side. And Jesus says, go to the other side of the lake. At which point, a teacher, in response to Jesus said, go, says, verse 19, I'll follow you wherever you go. It's quite a remarkable thing to say if you mean it. I'll follow you wherever you go. To be honest, it's probably not an unsurprising response at this point in the ministry of Jesus, because at this point in the ministry of Jesus, everything is very exciting. There's miracle after miracle taking place. As I said, last week you would have looked at a leper healed, a centurion servant, Peter's mother-in-law, and many others. So this is a teacher of the law has come to Jesus. Would have been a very religious man, most likely a scribe. You probably heard of scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. This is a scribe that's come to Jesus. If you read commentaries on this, Spurgeon, for instance, surmises that this scribe was most likely seeking a place of leadership amongst the disciples. When he says, I'll follow you wherever you go. And as a religious leader, he probably feels that he can get a place, well, this is what Spurgeon thinks, can get a place of leadership amongst the band of brothers that are at this point following Jesus. After all, they were mostly fishermen and uneducated men. And if this scribe, this teacher of the law, came into their group, perhaps he would be far more qualified to be one of the leaders. I don't know. I just include that as a point of interest. That's what Spurgeon thinks. Jesus' response to the teacher of the law saying, I'll follow you wherever you go, is quite interesting. As Jesus often does, he doesn't give the answer that you or I may expect he will give. He doesn't say, well, this is what's on the plan for the next 2 weeks. You better pack this and pack that. I'm going here. I've got this to do. I've got that to do. Jesus just says, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Foxes have holes, the birds, and so on and so forth. What's the date today? Anyone know the date? 25th of April. Okay. Last night, I slept in my bed for the first time, with the exception of one day, since March the 12th. Okay? There you go. Now, there's no marital issues. Okay? Let me explain this. On March the 13th, I left to go on pilgrimage. Actually, was that Capernaum? So that was 10 days. I came back, and on the day of my flight back, I discovered that I had COVID. I'm okay now, everybody. It's all right. And so therefore, I was banished to the spare room at home. My wife didn't want to be in the same room as me. So I was banished until I tested negative. I then had the one night back in my bed before my in-laws arrived from Canada and took possession of my bedroom. They've been here for 3 weeks. They're currently in the air now. I hope they are. So so they've been here for 3 weeks. So I've been on a mattress underneath my daughter's cabin bed for the last 3 weeks. So for I think it's about 6 weeks, I've had one night in my own bed. I'm not saying that for sympathy, but I kind of can relate to Jesus when he says the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. But whilst there's obviously some humour with that, what Jesus is saying is very different. I actually have had places to lay my head. In fact, the bed I slept on in Galilee, in the Ron Beach Hotel, is a much more comfortable bed than the one that I'm going to sleep in tonight. It had, sorry, this is a complete irrelevance to this. It had a remote control on it, this bed, which meant that if I pressed this, the back could come up, and so I could lie different ways. I did all these things and realised that the original setting that it was on was the most comfortable. So what's the point of all that? It even had a setting that I could press, and it adjusted the firmness of the mattress. It was lots of fun. Complete waste of time. But anyway, but what Jesus is talking about here is very different. Because in my situation, although I've not had my normal place to lay my head, I've always had a place to lay my head. But for Jesus, it's different. He wanted to tell the scribe what it's really like to be a disciple. There's a book that I've got, if anybody wants to borrow it, The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It just talks about this sort of stuff. There's a cost involved. And Jesus is very honest with the scribe. Jesus didn't say to the scribe, "Oh, you can't follow me." But he wants him to know that there is a cost involved in following him. Jesus is essentially saying, well, the comforts that you may be used to, you need to be willing to give those up if you're going to be following me. Jesus had homes open to him. Peter's was one of them, but he didn't have one to call his own. Matthew, it's one of these bits where you want to know, well, what happened to the teacher of the law? We don't know what the scribe does next. I suspect the prospect of giving up whatever home comforts looked like to him may have put him off. A bit like the rich young ruler. Do you remember? The rich young ruler came to Jesus. And Jesus told him what he had to do if he wanted to follow Christ. That was to do with wealth and possessions for the rich young ruler. Jesus said, well, give up everything you had and give it to the poor and come follow me. And it says the rich young ruler wasn't prepared to do that and walked away. Jesus didn't go running after him. Although Matthew doesn't tell us, I suspect there's a similar response from the scribe. So the scribe says, I'm willing to follow wherever you go. We then get another person who comes to Jesus, who is also expressing an interest in following Jesus more intently. We read about him in verse 21. Another disciple said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. Firstly, note how Matthew describes this person. I'm saying him. I apologise for that. He didn't say whether it's a man or a woman that comes to Jesus. Another disciple said to him, that's Jesus. Oh, but Jesus told him. It does, sorry. Yeah, my mistake. I should prepare for these things, shouldn't I? But notice how Matthew describes him. He describes him as another of his disciples. So this is somebody that seems to have already followed Jesus and put some aspect of faith in Jesus. When you hear the word disciple, if you're like me, you most probably initially think of the 12 disciples. But this passage here shows us that this term has a much broader meaning in the Gospel of Matthew. There were other disciples. the man wanted to follow Jesus, but not quite yet. It's as if he knew it was the right thing to do, but he had a good reason or an excuse as to why the timing wasn't quite right. Now, when I read the scriptures earlier, you may not have noticed it, but I did. When I read certain things, I heard some responses from some of you. Okay? Some of it was like, do you know what I mean? It was like almost as if what I'd read seemed quite harsh. Because on initial reading of this, it seems that this other disciple has quite a reasonable request. He says, "Let me first bury my father." What we need to understand is that this disciple that Jesus is encountering here isn't a person whose father has just died and wants to get the funeral dealt with before he comes and follows Jesus. That's not the context of this. It seems it could be when you read it. He says, I've got to bury my father first, as if like the coffin is around the corner and I've got to go and deal with this. We've got the funeral tomorrow. And that's what's got to happen. What he's actually requesting, if you read the commentators on this, and you need to understand maybe a little bit about kind of Middle Eastern culture, which is somewhat different to ours, what he's actually requesting is that he be given permission to stay in his father's house and care for him until the time when he passes on. That's what's the issue here. It's a bit like, I've got to be really careful here because my father's here. But it's a bit like Jesus calling me to do something. And I say, well, I ain't going until Dad's, until I dealt with Dad, okay? And that's not an unreasonable thing to do. And actually, Middle Eastern culture, and those of us that have been there and sat in the homes of people, when actually the father of the house is held in much greater esteem than we probably do here, it kind of, if you understand that, this becomes even more kind of pertinent. So what this man is saying is, yeah, I want to follow you, but actually, I'm not sure when that time will come. He wants to go back to his father's house, care for him. It's not an unreasonable thing, is it? It doesn't seem a poor thing to do. But this was for an indefinite period. And one of the commentators I read in preparation for this, in comparing these two people that respond to Jesus' invitation to cross to the other side of the lake, which is kind of code for follow me wherever I'm going. Don Carson says this. He says, the scribe was too quick in promising and the disciple was too slow in performing. Okay, now you need to get your head around that a little bit. What the scribe was saying is, I'll go and do this, I'll do that. Actually, he hadn't pulled it through. Yet the other disciple wasn't prepared to do what needed to be done to be able to be a wholehearted follower of Christ. Unlike with the scribe, Jesus encourages the disciple to follow him. Jesus says, follow me. And then says something that seems very strange. And let the dead bury their own dead. Jesus presses him to follow him now and makes it clear that other obligations must not be put ahead of following Jesus. He's essentially saying that Jesus must come first. And to both the scribe and the disciple here, Jesus was being completely honest with them. This is what it meant or means to be a disciple. And he wanted people to know right from the beginning. If you ever hear people, preachers or evangelists or whatever, kind of say, well, come to Christ and everything will be rosy, then run a mile from them. Jesus is saying here, if you come to me, there's a cost. Now, he's not saying, we mustn't misunderstand this, to say, well, it's not important to look after your father or anything like that. But what Jesus is saying is there's some things that are more important. Following Christ is the primary call in our lives. I think Jesus would have been very aware here that this disciple just wasn't ready to follow Jesus wholeheartedly, and the looking after the Father was just a convenient excuse to not wholeheartedly run after Christ. I wonder what it may be for you, and it may be for me, why we don't always follow the call of Christ wholeheartedly. Mentioned a little bit earlier, our primary call is to follow Christ. There are also what I would like to kind of refer to as secondary calls. Primary call is to follow Christ. The person who said he needs to first bury his father has been identified as a disciple. So he's responded, we must assume, to the initial call of Christ. But he then says, I firstly need to do this. And I wonder what he is missing out on. I suspect that although he identifies as a follower, he's not living in the fullness of what Christ has on offer. Jesus we see these words in John's Gospel. Jesus says, I have come to offer life. And then John continues, and life to the full. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, he prays, it's in chapter 3 of Ephesians, and his prayer is to the church at Ephesus, and it would be his prayer for the church in Plymouth too. He says, I pray that you would know this love that surpasses knowledge, and to be filled to the full measure of the fullness of God. I suspect that this disciple, who is coming up with a reason, however valid it might seem, coming up with a reason why he can't yet follow Christ or go with Christ, I suspect at that point in his journey, he hadn't been filled to the measure of the fullness of God. I've heard people say things like, they may not articulate it quite like this, but I would be a Christian, but I couldn't give up X, Y, or Z. But Jesus says it's all or nothing. The rich young ruler, it was wealth for him. For this disciple, it seems to be family connections. For you or for me or for people we know, it could be other things. The great reformer Martin Luther said this, and with this I'll close. He said, I have held many things in my hands, and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess. He says, I have held many things in my hands, and I've lost them. But whatever I've placed in God's hands, I still possess. It seems backwards thinking, doesn't it? But I'm sure you will understand the point that Luther is making there. And my prayer is that we'd all be courageous enough to be able to hand over everything to Christ so that we can live in the fullness of what he has for us. Amen? Amen.